Hi everybody, welcome back to part 2 of the overview of anatomy and physiology. On part 1 we reviewed everything you need to know about anatomy. Now we're going to talk about the physiology, an overview of what physiology is and why it is important to know this to understand how the human body works. So previously we mentioned that anatomy was all about studying the anatomical structure. So anatomy was all about structure, while physiology is all about functions, meaning is the study of the chemical and physics, so the chemistry and physics of the anatomical structures of the body to understand how they work together to support human life, to support functions. So one of the very first concepts that we need to understand is that in order for the human life to be alive, for the body to be alive, your organs require specific conditions, right? Conditions that as a whole, they're called homeostasis. Homeostasis is the way how your body maintain these internal conditions that will keep your organs functioning properly. So in real life, our body constantly is um, being exposed to conditions that might alter this homeostasis. Think about when you overdrink fluid like water, or moments when you're not drinking water at all, right? Or moments when you have infections, or moments when you're eating, or moments when you're fasting. All of these things will alter the homeostasis, and the functions of the anatomy or the organ system is to maintain homeostasis. So in a very easy and general way, if you don't eat, if you're fasting, your cells still need to have nutrients to maintain and to create ATP, which is energy. So in fasting states, the way how your body will handle the low sugar levels in blood is by finding ways how to get energy or increase your sugar levels so your organs can function properly. If you're in the summer and you're doing exercise and your internal temperature is raising up, is going up, your body has to have a way how to bring your temperature down to cool down and prevent overheat. So all of these things are the ones that we call physiological set points or normal ranges. These, once again, are things that your body needs in order for your organs, to work properly. If your body is not able to maintain homeostasis, your organs eventually will fail, and that can lead to death. So homeostasis is that. And there are two mechanisms how the body handles homeostasis, but the most important one is the negative feedback loop, which is the main way how your body maintains this homeostasis. We're going to talk about that at the end, but for now, that is the main concept you need to know about physiology. When we study anatomy for the first time, when we study the human body for the first time, we didn't know what were the functions of many of the organs that we know now. And the way how we got to the point that we are right now, understanding how the organ works and how the human body works, and even how medications can fix sometimes situations in which your organs are not working properly, is because we understand what's happening at the cellular level. It's important to know what are the levels of organizations. Basically, these levels of organization describe things that we start from big with the organismal level, which basically means that we start as a human, as an organism, right? We said then smaller than an organism is organ system, right? And we know that your organ system is a group of organs that work together to accomplish specific functions. And if we look at this picture, we take as an example the urinary system, which is composed by kidney, ureters, bladder, urethra. So the level of organization here is the organ system level. In order for us to understand how the urinary system accomplishes the function and to know what's the functions of the urinary system, we have to look at each of the organs and understand what is the function of each organ. So that means, for example, taking the bladder, which is one of the organs of the urinary system, and look at the bladder and try to figure out what is the function of the bladder. That is what we call the organ level of organization. So organ level of organization. Organs are composed by tissues. So an organ is a group of tissues that work together to accomplish a specific function. So what that means is that if we want to understand what is the function of the bladder, we need to look at the tissues that form the bladder to understand how the bladder works. And that will lead us to the tissue level of organization. The tissue level of organization basically states that in general we have four types of tissues. So if we know that all your organs are composed by tissues, or in other words, several tissues together form an organ, all your organs contain the four major tissues: epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. Those are the main tissues. So, as an example, the bladder, the urinary bladder, contains a special type of muscle called a smooth muscle. But also in the bladder you have epithelial tissue, in the bladder you have nervous tissue, and in the bladder you have connective tissue. So here I'm showing you the smooth muscle, just as you know that what forms the bladder is the combination of those four tissues, and the tissue that we take as an example here is the smooth muscle, which is a muscle tissue, but note that the bladder has also nervous tissue, epithelial tissue, and connective tissue. Now, the smooth muscle is the one that helps to the bladder to contract, right? Whenever, as we know now, the bladder, one of the functions is, of course, just to store urine. And when the bladder is full of urine, you have to contract a muscle called the detrusor muscle to squeeze the bladder and let the urine to go out through the urethra. But if we want to understand how muscle contraction occur and to understand how muscle is able to contract and generate a force, we have to look at even smaller. We have to look the cells that form those tissues. So that is what we call the cellular level. So see, our entire body is composed by billions of cells. And when you have many cells of the same kind working together as a unit, that's what forms a tissue. So if you are able to understand how the cells work, you will be able to then understand how the tissues work. And if you know how the tissues work, you will know how the organ work. And if you know how the organs work, you will know how the system works, and then you will be able to know how the human body works. So once again, what is the main point of this PowerPoint and what is important for you to know at this level is that the single or the smallest level basic unit life is the cellular level, the cells, okay, which is going to be chapter 3 in this course. So we're in chapter 1, right? In chapter 2, we're going to learn the chemical level of organization, which is to understanding how the atoms and elements and molecules, how they interact to each other, and which ones are the elements that are important for the human body. That is the chemical level. But you just know that the cellular level is the one that is going to be very important. Once again, cells of the same kind will form tissues. Tissues together form organs. Organs together form organ systems, and many organ systems together will form the organism. So this is pretty basic, but at the same time, it's something that many students miss in the exams, not knowing what forms what is smallest and what is big. So from small to big, this is that direction. Okay, tissues do not form cells. It is the opposite. Cells form tissues. Organs do not form tissues. It's the opposite. Many tissues together are the ones that form the organs. And in the same way, organ systems are composed or formed by many organs. So many organs together accomplishing and working for a specific function is what form an organ system. The course will follow this picture, this pattern. What I'm saying is we're having an overview of the human body, anatomy and physiology, which is your chapter 1. Your chapter 2 will cover the details about the chemical level. So we're going to learn here atoms and elements that are important for the human body. Your chapter 3 of this course will cover the cellular level. So here we're going to learn the details about the cells, what are the organelles, what are the fluid, what are the functions of each organelle, etc. In chapter 4, we're going to learn the details about the tissues, and you already learned some of these things, which that the four major tissues in the body are epithelial, connective, nervous, and muscle tissue and nervous tissue. And finally, once we reach this point, the rest of the course, chapter number 5, for example, we're going to learn the details of the first organ system, which is going to be integumentary system. After the integumentary system, we're going to continue with other systems like skeletal, then muscular system, nervous system, endocrine, etc. Now, there are other concepts that you need to be able to differentiate. One of them is functions of human life versus requirements for human life. So function of human life are things that humans or organisms, in this case humans, need to be able to accomplish in order to function properly. What that means is that we as an organism, as humans, we need to be able to perform, to have organization. So we just know that we have billions of cells, and those billions of cells form tissues, and those tissues organs, right? So, but there's an organization that is important to know. And when we lose that organization, bad things will happen. I'll give you some real life situations in which organizations uh, we lost organization, and then it leads to problems. Metabolism, which is one of the most important things that we need to accomplish in order to keep human functions. Responsiveness, movement, development, growth, and reproduction. Many of these concepts are very easy to understand just by reading the concept itself. So what I'm going to do is uh, I'm going to go very quick to the concepts that are very kind of self-explanatory, and then I'm going to focus on those concepts that are not that, easy to understand. So the first function is organization, and we kind of briefly mentioned that. Now, we said that our body is composed by trillions of cells, and those cells, they need to be organized. Now, when you lose any of the functions that I'm going to mention, that will lead to something bad. So what bad thing can happen if we lose organizations in our cells? Well, one of the things that we can think is cancer cells. And I'll give you an example, a quick example, and easy. So, for example, we have the organ called the esophagus. The esophagus is an organ that contains, muscle, nerves, and epithelial tissue, connective tissue, etc. All these cells that form the esophagus, they're organized in such a way that the esophagus has this tubular shape. So it's a tubular hollow organ that allows the food to, to transport the food from the oral cavity into the stomach. So when you have this nice organization, the esophagus function in a proper and correct way, just moving food from one side to another side. Now, all of this is possible because the tissues and the cells are well organized. What happens if somebody has a cancer? Okay, so cancers are mutations that occurs in the cells, and many cancers lead to an abnormal multiplication. I would say, yeah, multiplication or um, growth of cells that they grow without any restriction, or their growth in a very deorganized way. So with the example of the esophagus, many of the cancer cells will start growing without any restriction. And then the way how the tumor cells will grow is that they will just grow all over the place, and they will cause the growing of a mass. Now, if you think that this red area that I'm coloring here is a tumor, is a mass, as you can see here in this simple example, when you lose organization, the function now is impaired, because now when you're trying to digest and swallow food, now that you have a mass blockading the tube, now the esophagus is losing the function. And it's losing the function because this mass, this group of cells should not be growing there. There's lack of organization, they're overgrowing, they're growing too fast, and that is an important, or that analogy help you to understand why organization in the human body is pretty important to maintain the proper functions to keep human life. The most important concept I would say next is metabolism. Okay, the concept of metabolism is the sum of both anabolic and catabolic chemical reactions. So we need to know the difference between anabolism or anabolic versus catabolism or catabolic. So the easy way to think about this is that anabolism, and I'm going to clean this in the screen. Anabolism is the process whereby smaller or simpler molecules are combined into larger or more complex substances. Catabolism, on the other hand, is the opposite, is the process by which larger, more complex substances are broken down into smaller or simpler molecules. So the best way to think about catabolism, to me, I just look at the first three letters here, cat. For me, almost sounds like cut, like you're cutting something, right? So cutting. So when you're cutting something, think about a piece of paper, right? If you got the scissors and then start cutting, you start with a big, large page, or a piece of paper, and then that leads to a smaller and more simpler, uh, in this case, pieces of paper. So it's kind of the same thing that happens in the human body. When we do catabolism, basically we're breaking down things into the smallest component. Think about food, right? When you digest food, let's say proteins in your diet, your digestive system has to break those proteins down to the smallest components, which are the amino acids, or vice versa. Or using another analogy, let's say Lego pieces, right? So catabolism in the Legos analogy means that if you have like a house made out of Legos, that will be your complex or large molecule. A catabolism means you taking those Lego pieces and separate them from each other, and then you separate each individual Lego. That's a process of catabolism. You're cutting, you're reducing. Anabolism, on the other hand, think about A as adding. Okay, so C for cutting or cat, cutting, and A for adding. Anabolism is when you start from small to make something big or more complex. With the example of Legos is by you taking pieces of Legos and adding those Legos together to form something complex. That is anabolism. Anabolism is, for example, putting several amino acids together to form proteins, and that is what we can see in this illustration. Most of the catabolic reactions or catabolism will release energy, while anabolism will require energy. We're going to learn in chapter 2 that there is an important molecule called ATP. ATP stands for adenosine 3-phosphate, and basically it's a molecule that has adenosine. I'm going to put an A, and those adenosine molecules are they're bonded by chemical bonds. And each P stands for phosphate. And here's the thing, if you have this large molecule and you break this molecule, if you have a way to break this bond and separate that, that is an example of catabolism because you're cutting it, right? And when that happens, when you break this ATP molecule, that will release energy. And that is the energy that many cells will use to move or to do the things that the cell is supposed to be doing. So that's an example of catabolism because you're cutting a molecule and you're making something smaller and less complex by doing that. Responsiveness is the ability of the organism to adjust to changes in its internal and external environments. Movement is the ability of the human, not just, just to move internally, like your internal organs, your heart, your stomach, your intestine, but also externally, to move and to allow locomotion to move from one place to another. The other ones are development, growth, and reproduction. Once again, those are easy to understand if you just read the concepts. The most important ones that I want to invest more time were the organization and metabolism specifically. Now, let's review now requirements for human life. And these are the ones that sometimes the student confuse with functions, right, of human life. These ones are requirements for human life. That means that we have to have these 4 things in order for us to be able to survive in the environment. So without the followings, we will not be able to survive. That's what they're called requirements. The very first one is one of them is the most important and obvious, oxygen, right? Without oxygen, we will not be able to create this molecule called ATP that I just mentioned before. So the reason why we need to breathe is not just because of us, but because each individual cell that form our body needs oxygen. And the way how your cells will make in the most efficient way ATP, which is what the cells will use as energy, is combining oxygen plus sugar. And what is sugar? An example of this is glucose. So oxygen, we get the oxygen through the atmosphere every time we breathe, right? About 20% of the air that we breathe contains oxygen. And then where do we get the glucose? Well, that is coming from the point number 2, nutrients. So what is important here to know is that you need to combine some of the nutrients that you get through the diet versus the oxygen that you breathe. And those are the components, those are kind of the ingredients that the cell will use to make this recipe that will lead you to the creation of ATP. And this ATP is the chemical compound that the cell will use to get energy. Nutrients can be divided in 2, and this is important. macronutrients and micronutrients. So macronutrients refers to the fact not that they're big in size, but that we need large quantities of these nutrients to satisfy the body requirements. So we need large quantities of water, we need large quantities of carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. Micronutrients, micro refers that we don't need a lot of them, that we just need a little bit and our body will be okay. So examples of micronutrients are vitamins and minerals. The most important ones that we need to focus on here are these nutrients that our body will use to get energy. So energy yielding nutrients are carbohydrates and lipids. And hopefully you will know that lipids, uh, or it's important for you to know that lipids is the same to say fats, and carbohydrates is the same to say sugars. Okay, so the sugars and the fat that we consume is what the body is going to use to obtain energy. Now, the proteins that we consume in the diet, those are also known as body building nutrients because your body is going to use those proteins to build the stuff, to build proteins that will make up your muscle, proteins that will be antibodies or enzymes or hormones, etc. What are the other requirements? Well, a narrow range of temperature. Of course, if we live in an environment which the temperatures are too high or too low, we will not be able to survive. And many of the proteins, for example, that we have in our body are sensitive to temperature. Some of the proteins, they're going to suffer denaturization, which is something that we're going to learn in chapter 2, in which proteins misfold and loses the shape if the proteins are submitted under a specific temperature. So that's why sometimes fever can be fatal if you have hyperthermia. Hyperthermia is the medical term when your body temperature rises, and hyperthermia can be fatal because that can lead to destructions of proteins in the human body. Another requirement is narrow range of atmospheric pressure, right? So atmospheric pressure is something that also we have to have certain atmospheric pressure to facilitate many of the things, to facilitate um, you know the gases that we have in our blood to be diluted, to be dissolved, or even to be able to walk or to move, we have to have a specific atmospheric pressures. Now, atmospheric pressures is also something that is important to know in the process of breathing. Okay, when we take a deep breath, and the difference between pressures outside atmospheric pressure and the pressure you have in your lungs is important for breathing. But the details about these changes in pressure, we're going to learn that when we review the respiratory system and what happens sometimes when you have certain conditions in which, for example, uh, patients who exposed to high pressures, like those are in scuba diving, um, how what those pressures, how they can impact your health, and sometimes how you can fix it. Right? This is a hyperbaric chamber, which is used sometimes in situations in which decompression sickness will take place, and this is the way how you fix it. Now, I don't want to get in details about this. Just know that those are the four major requirements that we need, right, in our environment to be able to survive. We need oxygen in our environment. We need nutrients in our environment, carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. We need proper temperatures and proper atmospheric pressures in the environment. Now, to conclude this class, let's review one more time homeostasis. Remember that this is the way how your body maintains internal conditions, right? Maintain internal balance to keep those normal set points of blood pressure, sugar, temperature, pH, etc. under the normal range so your organs can function properly. Now, the way how your body maintains homeostasis is through negative feedback loop. And this is what is important to know. Negative feedback loop, there are two types of loops, and they just describe a mechanism that your body is going to do either to contrast an imbalance or to enhance an stimuli. It will make sense more. It will make more sense when I give you examples of those. But for now, just know that there are two types. There are negative feedback loop and there are positive feedback loop. Even though it's counterintuitive, the negative feedback loop is the most important one. Even though we think about negative, like we correlate that with something bad. In this case, the negative feedback loop alone is the one that maintains the body parameters within their normal range. And I'll tell you why it's called negative and why this is the one that is more important. Okay, the negative feedback loop is the most important one to maintain homeostasis, and we're going to see why. First, the negative feedback loop has three basic components. A sensor, which means something that should be able to detect any changes in the environment, internal environment, right? For example, something that will detect that your temperature is going too high or too low, or that your blood sugar is too high or too low, or that your blood pressure is too high or too low. That's the sensor component. A control center, which is something in your body, is a part of your body that will be able to take the information that comes from the sensor and decide what is the best response to fix it. So in other words, if your sensor is detecting that the body temperature is going too high, the control center is going to be something that will basically in a smart way, if you want to think about this way, something to fix the problem. So if the problem is that the temperature is going too high, the control center is something that will decide, okay, the temperature is high, we need to fix it, and we need to bring the temperature down to fix the problem. That is what the thinking part of um, of the negative feedback loop is the control center, and then the effector, which is the third component, is the way how the control center will um, activate or will stimulate to generate a change. So it's better to understand in this if we use examples. So for example, here we have, I started with temperature, right? So first we start with a body temperature that is, abnormal. So a body temperature that exceeds the 37 degrees, the Celsius. So that is the stimulus. The stimulus is something that causes an imbalance. The stimulus is something that right now is causing your temperature go high, go up. We have to have a sensor. So another way, we have to have a way that our body will realize that the temperature is going high. In this case, nerve cells in the skin and the brain can detect changes in temperature. That is the sensor. These nerves in this part of the brain that detects the temperature going up cannot do anything about it. The only thing that the sensor can do is to inform the control center to take a decision. In this example, the control center is located in the brain. And once the brain detects that the temperature is going high, then the brain will decide, okay, the stimulus is high temperature, that is bad. The response has to be something that will contrast the stimulus. So that's why it's called negative feedback loop, because the effect or the action that the body is going to use is going to be something against the stimulus. In this case, activation of sweat glands, right? Or drinking water, or looking for, if it's outside, right? That your body temperature is rising because the temperature in the environment, especially in the summer, gets too high, to look for shade, or to drink water, to look for a fan to cool down. So those are things that your body are trying to do to contrast the stimulus. Another example, just to keep this clear, is sugar, right? We know that high sugar or low sugar is bad, right? So if you have high sugar, especially after eating, right? That means that the stimulus in this case is high glucose level. That's the stimulus. A negative feedback loop is something that your body is going to do to bring your sugar levels down. Okay, so you see how they contrast each other. That's why it's called negative, because negative feedback loop plays against the stimulus. If the stimulus is, for example, low sugar, low glucose, that's the stimulus. A negative feedback loop refers to the ways how your body will try to do whatever is possible to bring the sugar levels back up. So we have the problem and we have a solution. And that's the way how we maintain homeostasis. If something is happening that is making your blood pressure go low, homeostasis means that your body, through a negative feedback loop, will do everything that is possible to bring the blood pressure up. So if the problem was low blood pressure, negative feedback loop will bring the blood pressure up. And we can apply all these examples, and that's why the negative feedback loop is the important one, because it's the one that brings balance again to the normal range.